You've been taught to believe that the voice in your head is you, your thoughts, your judgments, your fears, and your self-criticism. But what if that assumption is the first deception? What if the most powerful force shaping your life isn't society, trauma, systems, or even fate, but an inner voice that learned how to sound just like you? If every thought you hear were truly yours, why do they often self-sabotage? Why do they undermine your clarity, disrupt your peace, and keep you trapped in cycles you swore you'd outgrown? Most people never question this. They obey the voice, they argue with it, try to silence it, but never ask who is actually speaking. Hidden among the ancient writings buried for centuries in the sands of Egypt is a little-known, unsettling text known as the Book of Thomas the Contender. Not a gospel, not a comforting story, but instead an unsettling series of truths about your egoic mind. In this text, Jesus speaks not about heaven or salvation in the way you were taught, but about inner domination, self-deception, and a tyrant that rules from within. A ruler that doesn't command with force, but with familiarity and infiltration of the real you. The tyrant doesn't shout, it whispers in your own voice. Most people are not ready to question the one thing they rely on most, their own inner narrative, because doing so would expose the cracks of who they thought they were. In this video, we're going to explore what Thomas the Contender reveals about that inner tyrant, why it mimics you, how it maintains control through identification, and why simply seeing it begins to dissolve its power. But first, you need to understand where this text came from and why its message was never meant to be taught openly. Because once you recognize the tyrant, it can never rule you in the same way again. In 1945, a collection of ancient manuscripts was discovered near Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt. These texts had been deliberately buried, sealed in jars, and hidden away, not because they were unimportant, but because they were dangerous to authority and institutions built on obedience. Among these writings was Thomas the Contender. Unlike familiar religious texts, this work does not address crowds, it addresses one individual. There is no narrative arc, no parables meant to soften the blow, no moral storytelling to ease you into agreement. Instead, the text takes the form of a private dialogue, an intense, almost surgical exchange between teacher and student. And what's being dissected is not society, not politics, not sin, but the structure of the inner world. This was a hallmark of early Gnostic philosophy. While mainstream religious traditions focused on behavior, belief, and obedience, Gnostic texts focused on knowledge of self, not self-esteem, not self-improvement, but recognition. The recognition that something within the human psyche operates mechanically, repetitively, and against awareness itself. In the ancient world, this wasn't described in psychological language. There were no terms like ego, inner critic, or conditioning. Instead, these forces were described symbolically as rulers, authorities, powers, and tyrants. But these were not outer demons. They were inner structures. The Gnostics understood something that modern culture has mostly forgotten, that domination does not begin with chains or laws. It begins with identification, with believing that the voice narrating your life is who you are. This is why texts like Thomas the Contender were considered subversive. A person who recognizes the inner tyrant cannot be ruled easily. They are harder to shame, harder to manipulate, harder to keep asleep. Over time, as Christianity became institutionalized, these inward-facing teachings became inconvenient. A population encouraged to obey inner authority is far less controllable than one trained to obey outer rules. So texts that emphasized inner mastery were labeled heretical, dangerous, or simply erased from public teaching. What survived was a version of spirituality focused on belief and morality, while inner awareness was quietly removed from the equation. Yet the question never disappeared. Across centuries, mystics, philosophers, and contemplatives return to the same unsettling realization. There is a voice in the mind that claims ownership, but collapses the moment it is observed. Thomas the Contender stands at the center of this forgotten lineage, not as a comforting guide, but as a mirror. It doesn't ask you to follow, it asks you to see. And once you understand the philosophical context behind this text, the next realization becomes unavoidable. The tyrant it describes is not mythological, not symbolic in the way you've been taught to dismiss, but active, intimate, and survives entirely by convincing you that it is you. And once you understand how this inner tyrant operates and why it never reveals itself directly, you won't just recognize its strategy, you'll begin to regain control of your true self. The inner tyrant does not announce itself. It doesn't declare power. It doesn't demand obedience or tell you, "I am your ruler." Instead, it does something far more effective. It speaks as you. This is the central insight hidden inside Thomas the Contender. The greatest form of domination is not force. It is identification. The text makes this clear in a way that is easy to miss. Jesus doesn't warn Thomas about enemies out there. He doesn't point to corrupt systems or hostile powers in the sky. He points inward, toward a force that binds through habit, desire, fear, and unconscious repetition. The tyrant is not loud, it is familiar. It shows up as commentary, a running narration about who you are, what you should do, what you failed to do, what might happen next, what others think of you. It interprets every moment before you have a chance to see it directly. And because it sounds reasonable, because it sounds like your own thinking, it is rarely questioned. But here's the crucial distinction the text is pointing toward, which echoes many modern spiritual self-help books. You experience thoughts, but you are not the thoughts. That might sound obvious on the surface, but experientially, almost no one lives from that recognition. Most people live inside the voice. They argue with it, they justify it, they try to improve it, they try to silence it, but they never step out of it. The tyrant survives by keeping your attention fused to the stream of inner speech. As long as you believe that the voice is you, it maintains authority, not because it is powerful, but because it is unquestioned. This is why Thomas the Contender uses the language of struggle, contention, and battle. Not because you're meant to fight the voice, but because awakening feels like resistance to something that has ruled for a long time. Have you ever noticed that the moment you try to observe your thoughts, they change? They hesitate, they fragment, they lose coherence or go silent. That's not an accident. The inner tyrant cannot survive sustained awareness. It requires momentum, speed, and automaticity. The faster the voice moves, the less likely you are to notice that you are the one aware of it. This is why the text repeatedly emphasizes wakefulness, not belief, not obedience, not discipline, but presence. Because awareness interrupts the tyrant's favorite strategy, running unnoticed. The tyrant doesn't need to convince you of lies. It only needs to keep you busy reacting to memories, reacting to imagined futures, reacting to inner judgments that never pause long enough to be examined. And here's the most unsettling part. The tyrant often uses spiritual language. It can quote wisdom. It can mimic insight. It can turn awakening into another identity to defend. This is why many people feel stuck even after years of seeking. The voice simply adapts. It learns new words, new concepts, and new roles. But the structure remains the same. A voice narrating life, a sense of me attached to it, a constant background pressure to become, fix, escape, or achieve. Thomas the Contender isn't asking you to destroy this voice. It's asking you something far more radical. What happens when you stop believing it is you? Not suppressing it, not correcting it, not replacing it with a better one, just seeing it. Because the moment the tyrant is seen as an object of awareness, rather than the source of awareness, its authority begins to fracture. And yet, this is only the surface layer, because the text goes even further into why the tyrant fears silence why it thrives on desire and aversion, and why true freedom feels strangely disorienting at first. Thomas the Contender doesn't just reveal how the inner tyrant maintains control. It reveals what happens when you break that control, and the moment its power starts to collapse. Once you begin to see the inner tyrant, a deeper question emerges, one the text quietly circles, but never spells out in simple terms. Why does this voice cling so desperately to control? Because the tyrant is not sustained by power, it is sustained by movement. The moment things become still, it weakens. This is why Thomas the Contender repeatedly warns against being drunk, asleep, or consumed. These are not moral judgments. They are descriptions of attention captured and carried away. The tyrant survives by keeping your awareness in motion, pulled toward desire, pushed away from fear, caught in endless internal reactions. It feeds on polarity, wanting, resisting, judging, comparing. As long as you are leaning towards something or recoiling from something, the voice has a role to play. It becomes the commentator, the strategist, the protector, the critic. It keeps you busy with improvement, survival, and identity maintenance. And here's the paradox. The tyrant does not fear suffering nearly as much as it fears clarity. Pain can be narrated, confusion can be narrated, even spiritual seeking can be narrated. But direct seeing? That leaves it unemployed. This is why moments of genuine presence feel strange, disorienting, and almost empty. When the voice pauses, even briefly, you may feel a subtle anxiety, a sense that something is missing. The tyrant interprets this as danger. It says, "You're losing control. You need to think. You need to do something." But control was never yours to begin with. What Thomas the Contender reveals is that the tyrant's grip depends on your belief in continuity. The belief that there is a solid, consistent me running through every thought, emotion, and moment. But when you look closely, that me dissolves into fragments. A thought arises, it passes. A story forms, it collapses. What remains is not a voice. What remains is awareness. This is why the text speaks so sharply about ignorance, not as a lack of information, but as a mistaken identity. Ignorance is believing you are the narration instead of the one who hears it. And once this is seen, something remarkable happens. The tyrant doesn't die dramatically. It doesn't vanish forever. It simply loses credibility. It becomes like a character in a play you've already seen. It may still speak, but you no longer confuse the actor for the stage. This is also why the text avoids offering comfort, because comfort can become another attachment, another identity, another role for the voice to play. Instead, Thomas the Contender points toward a freedom that feels strangely ordinary, silent, unremarkable, a freedom that doesn't announce itself, because it doesn't need to. And yet, living from this recognition changes everything. Decisions become simpler, reactivity softens, and you begin responding instead of reacting. Not because you've mastered the tyrant, but because you've stopped mistaking it for yourself. But how do you allow this recognition to move from understanding into daily life? The answer to that question doesn't include rigid techniques or rituals, but subtle shifts in attention that slowly, naturally loosen the tyrant's grip. And once you shift, everything changes. What Thomas the Contender offers you is not a method to master, but a way of seeing to return to. Because the inner tyrant is very good at turning practices into identities. It will happily become the one who is doing awareness correctly, the one who is more conscious, and the one who is working on themselves. So instead of techniques, what follows are orientations, ways of meeting your inner experience that quietly dissolve the tyrant's authority without ever confronting it directly. Begin here, not by changing anything, but by noticing. Notice how the voice appears most strongly when something is at stake. When you want approval, when you fear loss, When you imagine the future, when you replay the past, ask yourself, not verbally, not analytically, but gently, is this voice happening, or is it being watched? Don't answer, just feel the question open. You may notice something subtle. The voice continues, but it no longer fills the entire space. There is distance, breathing room. This is the beginning. One simple invitation from the text is this: let the voice speak without responding, not suppressing it, not correcting it, not believing it, just allowing it to speak while you remain as the one who hears. At first, this can feel uncomfortable. The tyrant will protest. It will insist that something must be done, that thinking is necessary, and that silence is irresponsible. Let that be seen too. Another doorway opens through moments of interruption. Throughout your day, notice the spaces between thoughts, not forcefully, but naturally. The pause after a sentence ends, the gap before a reaction forms, the silence just before sleep. These moments are not empty, they are unclaimed. The tyrant cannot live there because there is nothing to narrate. And here's a gentle challenge to hold, rather than perform. When the voice arises, instead of asking, "Is this true?" ask something more destabilizing. Who would I be right now without believing this? Again, don't answer. Let the question loosen the grip. You may begin to notice that peace doesn't arrive as an emotion. It arrives as absence of interference. Life continues, thoughts arise, decisions happen. But the background tension, the need to manage, control, or narrate begins to soften. And when the tyrant returns, as it will, see that too. Each moment of recognition weakens identification. Each moment of noticing restores clarity. Over time, something shifts. You stop living from the voice and begin living with it, without obedience. This is what the text means by awakening. Not an event, but a reorientation. You are no longer trying to escape the mind. You are simply no longer mistaking it for yourself. If you've made it this far, then don't forget to download my free ebook, Escaping the Illusion, a Gnostic guide for mastering reality, which explores how to navigate the mechanics of illusion, identity, and awakening in everyday life. You can download it completely free using the link in the description. If you take nothing else from Thomas the Contender, take this. The tyrant was never an enemy you had to defeat. It was a mistaken identity you were asked to see through. All along, the voice that judged you, hurried you, frightened you, and pushed you to become someone else was never the source of your awareness. It was a function, a pattern, a familiar sound that learned how to borrow your sense of self. And the moment that recognition lands, even briefly, something irreversible happens. You don't become special, you don't become perfect, you become free. The inner tyrant may still speak, thoughts may still arise, and emotions may still move through you, but they no longer sit on the throne. What takes their place is not another voice, not a new identity, not a spiritual role to perform. What remains is simple, quiet, and present. This is why the text ends without resolution, without comfort, without promises. It leaves you with a living question rather than a doctrine. If you are not the voice, then what are you? And perhaps more importantly, what becomes possible when the one who is ruling no longer needs to be obeyed? If this exploration resonated with you, take a moment to acknowledge it by liking the video, sharing your reflections in the comments, and subscribing to the Gnostic Eye so you never miss our weekly teachings. Because once you question the voice, a door opens that never truly closes again.